The gospel reading today is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, verses 23 to chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. And so he said to the man who had a withered hand, "Come forward." And then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out immediately, conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him.
Thank you, Ken. In today's reading, we are presented with a question. How important is the law in the life of a believer? Our story begins with Jesus and his followers traveling on the Sabbath. They are passing through a grain field, and as they go, they are plucking the heads off the grain and eating them. Some Pharisees are there and call this action of the disciples into question. They should not be doing this. It is against religious law. In response to this charge, Jesus reminds them of a story from the book of 1 Samuel, when David ate the shewbread, which was forbidden to be eaten by anyone but a priest. As an example, he lists this as an example from Scripture of a time when someone was allowed to break a similar law. Jesus sums this up saying, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Then they all proceed to the synagogue, where they find a man with a crippled hand. Jesus asks them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" And then he heals the man. To discuss what happens in this text, we need to understand a few pieces of background. The first thing I want to look at is why the actions of the disciples was considered illegal. It's important to note that this is not a case of theft. The illegality of taking and eating the heads of the grain has nothing to do with possession. It's not illegal because the grain was the property of the farmers who were raising it. On the contrary, the law allowed for travelers to do this very thing. It was looked at as normal and lawful for travelers to feed themselves in this way on any other day. Just not on the Sabbath. Because removing the heads from the grain was seen as a form of harvesting, it was against the law's prohibition of work on the Sabbath to do so. Likewise, the healing of the man at the synagogue would have been prohibited by the same law because it was classified as work. Medical actions were permitted on the Sabbath day, but only when there was a life-threatening situation. If someone had a medical injury or some sort of accident or emergency happened where the person would die if not treated on that day, the law allowed for that person to be treated on the Sabbath. Otherwise, in non-life-threatening situations, only the bare minimum of medical treatment was allowed. Actions could be taken that would prevent a medical issue from getting worse, but not anything that would actually improve or heal the issue. Since the man Jesus heals does not have a life-threatening issue, and he'd be no worse off if Jesus waited until the next day to heal him, therefore the healing is a violation of the laws concerning the Sabbath. But Jesus says the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Here, Jesus basically says that he, as the Son of Man, is Lord over the Sabbath, and therefore can use the Sabbath day as he sees fit. And at least on this particular Sabbath, he saw fit to heal this man and to allow his disciples to eat the grain from the field. So what exactly is Jesus establishing in these actions? And what does that tell us about how we should be observing the Sabbath and about how we should be living our lives, about our relationship to law and our relationship to grace? There's a few things to establish about what Jesus is not doing here. First off, he is not condemning or eliminating the idea of the Sabbath. By calling himself Lord of the Sabbath, he is implying that the Sabbath is still important and that its observance is important. The use of the word even here tells us how important the Sabbath is. That the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath tells us that the Sabbath is an important thing for the Son of Man to be Lord over. But he also says that the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. And so this again sets up a couple of things as far as their importance to God. God made the Sabbath to be something that benefited mankind and not the other way around. God established a day set aside to rest and to concentrate on what is holy because God knew that such a day would benefit us, not because he wanted us to feel bound to such a day. I think we can extend that concept to a few other things, including the church, our traditions, and the law itself. We sometimes have traditions in church that we consider important. Things that we have done forever. Things that are important to us. But it's important to remember that these things are in place to benefit the members of the church. And that we should always place the safety and security and well-being of our members and others first. And if there are traditions that compromise these things, it is okay to change or even remove some of these traditions in order to benefit the people. It's important to remember that in what he says, Jesus is neither condemning or removing the need for the law. The law is important and it is vital. We must have rules that dictate our behavior. But like those church traditions, and like the Sabbath, the law is made for the benefit of humankind and not the other way around. The law dictates how we treat each other for the benefit of us. Sometimes people can have a view that God is someone who really cares about the rules, that the rules are God's chief concern, and that in order for us to live a good and godly and holy life, we just have to follow those rules and check off those boxes, dot those I's, and cross those T's. And while I think we have to recognize that God must care about the laws that he's established, that those laws are not God's chief concern. God cares more about us, the children of God. The law is in place to protect us and to keep us from harming each other. But that means that when the law harms people, or when the law allows us to harm each other, that there is a greater law that must take precedence. After all, Jesus said that the greatest commandment was to love God and to love our neighbors. And while it is important for us to follow the laws that God has given us, the greater law that he also gave means that when a law conflicts with the idea of loving our neighbor, we are to choose love over law. David knew this, and so did the priest who gave him the holy shewbread. It's not that the priest rejected the law about the shewbread being reserved for the priests, but that he knew that feeding someone who was hungry was more important. Jesus knew this about his disciples eating the grain. It's not that he was dismissive about the law of not harvesting on the Sabbath, but that he knew that his disciples were more important than the law. And he knew this about healing the crippled man. It's not that he didn't respect the law about not working on the Sabbath, but that he knew that healing the man was more important, because the law was made to benefit mankind, not the other way around. There will be times when we must look at the laws and the rules that we follow and wonder whether they benefit people, whether they help or hinder. And sometimes we will need to change laws. Sometimes we will need to make exceptions to the rules, because sometimes we will need to recognize that the law should benefit us and not the other way around. This is not to say that we don't respect the law. It's because we do respect it. Because we recognize its place in keeping order and keeping peace, but we also recognize how much having rules benefits humankind. But also because we respect the higher law of loving one another, of recognizing that sometimes a good law can be used to hurt people, and that the higher law of loving and healing and protecting each other requires us to sometimes bend the rules. There are Christians and others in this world who believe that being a good person means simply following all the rules. And that is a big part of it. Like I said, Jesus does not dismiss the law here, but it's only a part of leading a Christian life. It's not enough to follow the rules. It's not enough to simply make sure that we don't do the don'ts. We have to do some of the do's. It's not enough to look at the list of the thou shalt nots and make sure that we don't do those things. We have to make sure that we are doing the things that express love to our neighbor, and through that, love of our God. We have to make sure that we are feeding those who are hungry and healing those who are broken. We have to make sure that while we honor the rules, that we honor more those who the rules are made to benefit. And at the end of the day, the answer of how to do that lies, as often it does, in the idea of loving our neighbor. We have to make sure that our neighbors come first. That we don't put our laws and our churches and our institutions and our traditions above those who need our help and our healing and our grace and our love. And if we can live up to that idea of loving our neighbor, then we will be living up to the highest dictates of God's law. Thanks be to God.